The lawyer's signature was forged on my will. I stared at the document in my trembling hands, recognizing every curve and loop of the handwriting. It was Diane's. My best friend of 30 years had perfectly copied the attorney's signature, making herself the sole beneficiary of everything I owned. My house, my savings, my late husband's life insurance money, even my mother's jewelry. All of it would go to her when I died. My knees buckled. I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter, fighting the wave of nausea that crashed over me. The room spun violently as I read the date, 3 months ago, right after my cancer diagnosis. While I'd been terrified about treatment and survival, Diane had been planning for my death. The paper crumpled in my fists as my whole body began to shake. 30 years of friendship, and she'd been waiting for me to die. Diane Richardson had been more than my best friend. She'd been my sister in every way that mattered. When my husband Robert passed 5 years ago, she held me through the funeral. When I got diagnosed with breast cancer this spring, she drove me to every appointment, held my hand during chemo, brought me soup when I was too weak to cook. I'd trusted her with my house key, my bank information, my deepest fears about dying alone. She knew I had no children, no family left, except a distant cousin in Oregon I hadn't spoken to in decades. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Every kind gesture, every gentle word, every tear she'd shed for my pain, it had all been an act. She hadn't been supporting me through cancer treatment. She'd been making sure I stayed alive long enough to sign away my future. The woman who'd promised to take care of my affairs, just in case something happened, had already decided what those affairs would be. My death wasn't a tragedy to her. It was a windfall. I remembered the day she'd suggested updating my will, how concerned she'd sounded. "Barbara, honey, you need to think about these things," she'd said, squeezing my hand across her kitchen table. "What if the treatment doesn't work? You don't want the state deciding where your things go." Her voice had been so gentle, so caring. I'd felt grateful to have someone looking out for me, someone practical enough to handle the difficult conversations I couldn't face. She'd even offered to help me find a lawyer, claimed her neighbor was an estate attorney who could handle everything quietly, professionally. The neighbor had been real enough. I'd met him briefly, signed the papers in his office while Diane waited in the reception area. But somewhere between his desk and my filing cabinet, she'd created her own version. Months of planning, months of lies, months of watching me suffer while calculating her profit. She'd probably been hoping the cancer would move faster. Every time I'd celebrated a clear scan or a successful treatment, she must have been disappointed. Every time I'd talked about my future, about traveling once I was better, about maybe dating again someday, she must have been screaming inside. I smoothed out the forged document and read it again, looking for any detail I'd missed. The house at 412 Oak Street, my childhood home that I'd inherited from my parents. The savings account with $43,000 that Robert and I had built over 25 years of marriage. The investment portfolio worth another $60,000. Even my car, my furniture, my grandmother's china set. Diane had inventoried my entire life and claimed it for herself. She'd turned my trust into her retirement plan. My phone buzzed with a text message. Diane, of course. "How are you feeling today, sweetie? Want me to bring dinner over?" The casual endearment that had always warmed my heart now felt like poison. I could picture her typing it, probably wondering if today might be the day I'd take a turn for the worse. Maybe she'd even researched my type of cancer, learned the survival statistics, calculated her odds. The woman who'd held my hand during chemo had been counting down to my death. This was war. I needed proof. Real, undeniable evidence that would expose Diane for what she really was. The forged will was damning, But I knew she'd find a way to explain it away. Claim it was a misunderstanding, that she'd been trying to help, that I was confused from the medication. She was clever like that, always had been. 30 years of friendship had taught me exactly how her mind worked. My hands still trembled as I folded the fraudulent document and slipped it into my purse. The familiar weight of betrayal sat heavy in my chest, but underneath it, something else was growing. Determination. If Diane thought she could steal my life while pretending to save it, she was about to learn otherwise. I grabbed my car keys and headed for her house. The drive to Diane's place felt surreal. How many times had I made this same trip over the years? Hundreds, maybe thousands. Racing over when her divorce papers came through, bringing casseroles when she had the flu, celebrating birthdays and holidays, and every small victory in between. Her modest ranch house at the end of Maple Street had been my second home. Now it felt like enemy territory. I parked across the street and waited. Diane's silver Honda wasn't in the driveway. She'd mentioned having a hair appointment this afternoon. Perfect. I knew where she kept the spare key, hidden under the fake rock by her back porch. The same place she'd kept it for 15 years, ever since she'd locked herself out during a dinner party and had to climb through her bedroom window in front of all her guests. The key turned easily in the lock. Walking into Diane's house uninvited felt wrong, but not as wrong as what she'd done to me. The familiar smell of her lavender air freshener hit me immediately, along with the faint scent of the vanilla candles she burned constantly. Everything looked exactly the same. The beige sectional sofa where we'd watched countless movies. The kitchen table where we'd shared so many conversations. The bookshelf lined with romance novels and self-help guides. I started with her desk in the corner of the living room. The drawers were neat and organized, just like everything else in Diane's life. Bills sorted by due date, warranties filed alphabetically, a small wooden box containing spare buttons and safety pins. Nothing suspicious. But I knew Diane better than that. She was meticulous about hiding anything important. Her bedroom felt more invasive to search, but I pushed through the discomfort. The nightstand contained the usual items: reading glasses, lip balm, a romance novel with a bookmark halfway through. The dresser drawers revealed nothing but carefully folded clothes. I was starting to wonder if I was wrong, if maybe the forged will was an isolated incident, when I remembered her home office. Diane had converted the spare bedroom into a workspace years ago, complete with a computer desk and filing cabinet. She'd always been proud of how organized she kept her finances, often joking that she should have been an accountant instead of a nurse. The filing cabinet was locked, but I knew Diane's habits. She kept important keys in the small ceramic dish on her kitchen counter, mixed in with loose change and hair ties. The second key I tried opened the cabinet. Inside were manila folders labeled with various categories: taxes, insurance, medical records, warranties, everything perfectly organized and completely normal. I was beginning to feel foolish when my fingers found a folder wedged behind all the others, unlabeled and slightly thicker than the rest. My stomach dropped when I opened it. The first document was a photocopy of my birth certificate. Not unusual by itself. Diane had helped me organize my important papers when Robert died, so she'd seen all my documents. But why would she have copies? My hands shook as I flipped to the next page. A copy of my marriage certificate. Then Robert's death certificate. My cancer diagnosis paperwork. Even my most recent lab results from last week's appointment. She'd been building a file on me, documenting every aspect of my life like I was some kind of case study. The papers were organized chronologically, starting from 5 years ago, right after Robert's funeral. She'd been collecting information about me for years, not just since my cancer diagnosis. My chest burned with the realization that her betrayal went so much deeper than I'd imagined. The next section made my knees buckle. Handwritten notes in Diane's careful script, dated and detailed like a researcher's journal. Barbara, struggling with loneliness since Robert's death, mentions feeling like she has no purpose anymore. Excellent opportunity to position myself as indispensable. The clinical tone made my skin crawl. She'd been studying me, analyzing my vulnerabilities like a predator sizing up prey. I sank into her desk chair, my legs too weak to support me. Page after page of observations, strategies, manipulations. Suggested girl's trip to distract from grief worked perfectly. Barbara now sees me as her primary emotional support. Encouraged her to update life insurance beneficiary to me, just temporarily. She agreed immediately. Cancer diagnosis provides perfect opportunity for estate planning discussion. Every kindness, every gesture of friendship had been calculated. The soup she'd brought during chemo wasn't compassion, it was investment protection. The hand-holding during doctor appointments wasn't support, it was intelligence gathering. She documented my treatment schedule, my medication side effects, even my emotional responses to different test results. Barbara very fearful about mortality. Push estate planning harder. My vision blurred with tears as I read her analysis of my character. Barbara trusts completely once someone proves themselves. Weakness can be exploited. No close family relationships, perfect isolation. Extremely grateful for any help, never questions motives. She'd identified every insecurity, every need, every way to manipulate my emotions. I wasn't her best friend. I was her mark. The worst part was how well she knew me. Every observation was accurate, every weakness correctly identified. She'd spent 30 years learning exactly how to hurt me, how to use me, how to make me grateful for my own destruction. The friendship I'd treasured had been her research project. But it was the final section that destroyed me completely. Financial projections, written in Diane's neat handwriting, calculating the value of my estate. She'd estimated my house at $200,000, my savings and investments at just over $100,000, even assigned monetary values to my jewelry and furniture. At the bottom of the page, circled in red ink, total estimated value, $347,000. She'd put a price tag on my death. Below that, more calculations, her current debt, credit cards, car loan, mortgage balance, her projected retirement needs, how my money would solve all her financial problems. She'd even researched cancer survival rates for my specific diagnosis and stage, noting the average life expectancy in the margins. Likely timeline, 6 to 18 months if treatment fails. My hands shook so violently I could barely turn the pages. There were photocopies of my bank statements. Somehow she'd accessed my accounts and documented every deposit, every withdrawal, every financial detail of my life. She knew exactly how much money I spent on groceries, utilities, medication. She'd been tracking my spending patterns like a forensic accountant. The final document was a timeline she'd created, mapping out her strategy month by month. Phase 1. Establish herself as indispensable after Robert's death. Phase 2. Gradually isolate me from other relationships. Phase 3. Position herself as my emergency contact and estate executor. Phase 4. Exploit cancer diagnosis for legal documentation. Phase 5. Wait for nature to take its course. I was currently in Phase 4. She was waiting for me to die. The folder contained evidence of a 5-year con game, meticulously planned and perfectly executed. Every lunch date, every phone call, every shared memory had been part of her long-term strategy. She'd stolen my friendship, my trust, my future, and my dignity. I'd been living with a stranger who'd been wearing my best friend's face. My phone buzzed. Another text from Diane. "Haven't heard from you today? Everything okay?" The casual concern that had once comforted me now felt like a hunter checking her traps. She was probably wondering if I'd discovered the will yet, calculating whether today might be the day her plans started unraveling. I photographed every document with my phone, my hands steadier now that shock was giving way to fury. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, devastating. But as I prepared to leave, something made me check one more place. Diane's computer was password protected, but I knew her well enough to guess. Her mother's maiden name plus her birth year, the same combination she used for everything. The desktop contained the usual folders, but one caught my attention. B Project. Inside were dozens of files, including recordings, audio files with dates going back months. My blood turned to ice as I clicked on the most recent one and heard my own voice, tinny and distant, but unmistakably mine. She'd been recording our conversations. The file was from last week's lunch at the diner downtown. I listened to myself talking about my latest test results, sharing my fears about the future, thanking her for being such a wonderful friend. Her responses sounded so genuine, so caring. But now, I could hear the calculating tone underneath, the way she guided the conversation toward my finances, my estate planning, my lack of other close relationships. There were dozens of recordings, months of private conversations, secret fears, intimate details about my marriage, my health, my loneliness. She'd been building a psychological profile, documenting my emotional state, creating an archive of my trust. Every vulnerable moment I'd shared had been captured and cataloged like evidence in a case file. I found recordings from my darkest days, conversations where I'd cried about missing Robert, where I'd admitted being scared of dying alone, where I'd expressed gratitude for having Diane in my life. She'd recorded me at my weakest moments and used that information to manipulate me further. The betrayal was so complete, so thorough, that I could barely breathe. There was more, so much more I didn't know. One folder on the desktop made my stomach lurch. Insurance policies. Inside were detailed research files about life insurance fraud, articles about contested wills, and legal precedents for challenging estate documents. She'd been studying how to ensure my death would benefit her without any legal complications. But it was the subfolder labeled contingencies that made my blood freeze. Diane had researched what would happen if I recovered from cancer, if I lived longer than expected, if I changed my mind about the will. She'd prepared for every scenario except the one happening right now. Me discovering her scheme. The most chilling file was titled Acceleration Methods. My hands trembled as I opened it, not wanting to see what was inside but unable to stop myself. Medical research about drug interactions with cancer medications. Information about subtle ways to worsen a patient's condition. Articles about caregiver-induced complications in terminal patients. She'd been researching how to help me die faster. I scrolled through pages of research about medications that could interfere with chemotherapy effectiveness, foods that might exacerbate nausea and prevent proper nutrition, activities that could weaken an already compromised immune system. She'd been studying how to kill me slowly, naturally, in ways that would never be questioned or investigated. There were notes in the margins, written in her careful handwriting. Barbara always takes evening medications with orange juice. Easy delivery method. Refuses to eat when nauseous. Opportunity to accelerate weight loss. Trusts me completely with medication reminders. Room for adjustment. She'd been planning to poison me with kindness, literally. My chest burned with each revelation. The woman who'd driven me to chemotherapy appointments had been researching how to sabotage my treatment. The friend who'd brought me soup when I was too sick to cook had been calculating how to make me sicker. Every gesture of care had been a potential weapon. I found a detailed calendar marking my chemotherapy schedule, doctor appointments, and medication routines. But more disturbing were the notes she'd added. Barbara seemed stronger today. Concerning. Good response to treatment. May need intervention. Doctor optimistic about prognosis. Problem. She'd been tracking my recovery like an enemy monitoring a threat. The subfolder labeled Backup Plans contained research about psychological manipulation techniques for terminally ill patients, articles about induced depression in cancer patients, methods for isolating vulnerable individuals from support systems, ways to convince someone their situation was more hopeless than it actually was. She'd been systematically destroying my will to live while pretending to support me. I discovered she'd been in contact with other people in similar situations, online forums where predators shared strategies for exploiting elderly and sick individuals. Her username was Patient Helper, and she'd posted dozens of times, sharing techniques she'd used on me and asking for advice about overcoming obstacles. She'd turned my suffering into entertainment, my trust into a case study for other criminals. The posts were nauseating to read. Target is responding well to isolation techniques. Successfully eliminated most outside relationships. Financial documentation complete. Subject signed everything without reading details. Health declining on schedule. Estimate 6 months maximum before payout. She'd been providing real-time updates about my deterioration to strangers on the internet. Other forum members had replied with encouragement and additional suggestions. Try increasing social dependency. Make yourself the only source of emotional support. Document everything for insurance purposes. Paper trail is crucial. Consider relocating target to area with fewer oversight resources. They were coaching each other on how to exploit vulnerable people more effectively. I found private messages between Diane and someone called Estate Master, discussing my specific situation in detail. She'd shared my medical records, financial information, and psychological profile with a complete stranger. They'd analyzed my case like a business opportunity, calculating profit margins and risk assessments. My life had become their joint venture. The conversation threads revealed this wasn't Diane's first attempt at estate fraud. She'd mentioned previous successes and lessons learned from earlier targets. There were references to other elderly women, other carefully cultivated relationships, other deaths that had enriched her bank account. I wasn't her friend. I was her latest victim in a pattern of systematic predation. My phone buzzed with another text from Diane. Getting worried about you, coming over to check on you after my appointment. She'd be here within the hour. My heart pounded as I realized she was probably suspicious about my absence, concerned that her carefully laid plans might be unraveling. The caring friend act was slipping into protective mode. I frantically searched through more files, knowing my time was limited. In a folder marked Legal Contingencies, I found documents showing she'd researched how to challenge my mental competency if I tried to change the will. She'd been preparing to have me declared mentally unfit, using my cancer diagnosis and medication side effects as evidence of impaired judgment. There were draft petitions for guardianship, medical records she'd somehow obtained, and statements from witnesses who would testify to my declining mental state. She'd been building a case to have me legally declared incompetent, ensuring that even if I discovered her scheme, I'd have no legal recourse to stop her. The witness statements were from people I barely knew: the grocery store clerk, my mailman, a neighbor I rarely spoke to. Somehow she'd convinced them to sign documents claiming they'd observed concerning changes in my behavior, memory lapses, confusion about basic tasks. She'd been systematically destroying my reputation in the community, creating a paper trail of incompetency. But it was the medical records that horrified me most. Somehow she'd gained access to my private medical files and had been sharing them with people who were helping her build the incompetency case. My test results, treatment responses, medication lists, all of it had been distributed to strangers who were helping her steal my life. I found correspondence with a lawyer, Not the fake one whose signature she'd forged, but a real attorney who specialized in elder law and estate disputes. She'd been consulting with him about the legal requirements for having someone declared incompetent, the timeline for guardianship proceedings, and the best strategies for defending against will contests. She'd prepared for every possible scenario. The lawyer's responses were clinical and professional, but they revealed the depth of Diane's preparation. She'd provided him with detailed documentation about my supposed mental decline, fabricated incidents of confusion and poor judgment, and a timeline showing progressive deterioration. She'd been building a fictional narrative about my mental state while I trusted her completely. My vision blurred with tears as I read through consultation notes where she'd described me as increasingly paranoid and suspicious, showing signs of dementia-related personality changes, and becoming hostile toward people trying to help her. She'd been laying groundwork to discredit anything I might say about her betrayal. In the final folder, labeled Timeline Acceleration, I found the most devastating evidence yet. Diane had been researching my specific type of cancer, its progression patterns, and factors that could worsen the prognosis. But more than that, she'd been tracking my actual medical improvement and was growing increasingly frustrated with my positive response to treatment. There were angry posts in the online forums complaining that I was taking too long to decline and asking for advice about encouraging natural progression. She'd been consulting with other predators about how to ensure I died on schedule before I could discover her betrayal or change my mind about the will. The most recent entries showed growing desperation. Target showing unexpected improvement. Doctor optimistic about extended survival. Need alternative strategies immediately. She'd been planning something more direct, more aggressive. The passive waiting was over. She was preparing to take active steps to ensure my death. My hands shook as I closed the laptop. The scope of her betrayal was beyond anything I could have imagined. She hadn't just stolen my money. She'd stolen years of my life, my peace of mind, my ability to trust anyone ever again. She'd turned my cancer diagnosis into her opportunity, my grief into her advantage, my friendship into her weapon. The sound of a car in the driveway made my blood freeze. She was back early. There was more, so much more I didn't know. I grabbed the laptop and ran toward the back door, but the sound of her key in the front lock stopped me cold. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized I was trapped. The back door was too far, too noisy. She'd hear me trying to escape. I shoved the laptop back where I'd found it and dove behind the kitchen counter just as the front door opened. Through the gap beneath the cabinets, I could see her feet moving across the hardwood floor. She wasn't walking normally. Her steps were quick, purposeful, suspicious. "Barbara?" Her voice carried a false sweetness that made my skin crawl. "I know you're here. Your car's in my driveway." My mind raced. I'd parked in her driveway like I always did when I visited. Such a normal thing that now felt like a death sentence. She knew I was inside her house, going through her things, discovering her secrets. "Come out, honey. We need to talk." The endearment that once made me feel loved now sounded like a threat. I pressed myself against the cabinet, trying to make myself invisible, while my mind screamed with the horror of everything I'd just learned. She wasn't just planning to steal from me. She was planning to kill me. Her footsteps moved toward the living room where I'd been searching. I heard her sharp intake of breath, probably noticing that things weren't exactly as she'd left them. Despite my efforts to be careful, she could tell someone had been through her files. "I'm disappointed in you, Barbara." Her voice was closer now, moving toward the kitchen. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? Sneaking around like a common thief?" The irony of her words would have been laughable if terror wasn't crushing my chest. She was calling me the thief while she'd spent months planning to murder me for my money. "I found your little research project," I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. There was no point hiding anymore. She knew I was here, knew I'd discovered her betrayal. The insurance policy, the poison research, all of it. Her laugh was cold, nothing like the warm sound I'd treasured during our friendship. "You always were too smart for your own good. I told him that about you." Him. My blood turned to ice. There was someone else involved, someone she'd been discussing my murder with. The forms, the consultations, they weren't just anonymous strangers giving advice. She had a partner. "Who is he?" I stood up slowly, keeping the kitchen island between us. She looked different somehow, like a mask had been removed. The caring expression she'd worn for months was gone, replaced by something calculating and cold. "Does it matter? You won't be meeting him." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small bottle of pills. My pills. The ones she'd been bringing me from the pharmacy for weeks. "These aren't your regular medication, by the way. Haven't been for almost a month now." My knees nearly buckled. The pills I'd been taking religiously, trusting her to pick up my prescriptions, believing she was helping me fight my cancer. They'd been something else entirely. Something designed to make me sicker, weaker, more dependent on her care. "What did you give me?" My voice came out as a whisper. "Nothing fatal. Not yet." She shook the bottle, the pills rattling like bones. "Just something to slow your recovery, make your doctors think the cancer was progressing faster than expected. But you kept getting better anyway. Your body kept fighting despite everything." The room spun as I processed her words. My recent fatigue, the setbacks in my treatment, the confusing test results that had worried my doctors. It hadn't been the cancer at all. It had been her, systematically poisoning me while pretending to care for my health. "The insurance policy requires natural causes," she continued conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather. "Cancer death is perfect. No one questions it, especially with your medical history. But you had to be stubborn about dying." "So you decided to help things along." I backed toward the sliding door, but she moved to block my path. "The original plan was so elegant. Comfort you through your final months, be the devoted friend everyone admired, then inherit everything when you passed peacefully in your sleep. But you kept improving, kept responding to treatment. Do you have any idea how frustrating that was?" Her casual tone while discussing my murder made my stomach lurch. This wasn't a moment of desperate greed. This was calculated, planned, executed, with the cold precision of someone who'd done this before. "The other women in your forums," I said, pieces clicking together. "They weren't theoretical targets. You actually killed them. 3 successful cases over the past 5 years. She said it with the pride of someone discussing career achievements. Lonely widows, each with substantial assets and no close family. Each one trusted me completely, signed their wills without question, died of natural causes within the expected time frame. My legs felt like water. She wasn't just a friend who'd gotten greedy. She was a serial killer who specialized in elder fraud and murder. I'd been targeted, selected, groomed like livestock for slaughter. "But you," she continued, shaking her head with genuine annoyance. "You had to be different. Your cancer should have killed you months ago, but instead, you're getting stronger. Your doctors are talking about remission. That simply won't work for my timeline. So you're going to kill me yourself." It wasn't a question. "The pills you've been taking have built up a nice foundation in your system, enough to mask what comes next." She reached into her purse again and pulled out a syringe. This will trigger a cardiac event. With your medical history and the medication interactions, no one will question it. Just a tragic complication of your cancer treatment. The syringe gleamed under the kitchen lights. She'd planned this moment, prepared for the possibility that I might discover her scheme. The Caring Nurse Act had been replaced by Efficient Killer, ready to tie up loose ends. "Your partner," I said, stalling for time while I calculated distances to possible exits. "Is he here? Waiting outside?" "He's handling the cleanup, making sure there's no evidence of your little investigation today." Her smile was arctic. "By the time they find your body, every trace of your discovery will be gone. Just a sick woman who had a heart attack while visiting her dear friend." The cleanup. That meant someone else was destroying evidence right now. Probably going through my house, removing any trace of my suspicions. Even if I somehow escaped, they'd already thought steps ahead. "The will," I said, understanding flooding through me. "You don't just get my money. You get to play the grieving friend. Everyone will comfort you, praise you for being so devoted to me in my final days." "Exactly. I'll be the tragic figure who lost her best friend, despite doing everything possible to help. The sympathy will be almost as valuable as the inheritance." She moved closer, syringe ready. People love a devoted caregiver. It opens doors to other lonely, wealthy women who need a friend. Other women, she was already planning her next victims, using my death and the sympathy it generated to find new targets. My murder wasn't an ending for her. It was a stepping stone to more killings, more stolen lives. "You won't get away with this." But even as I said it, I knew how carefully she'd planned. The false medical records, the forged documents, the systematic isolation of me from anyone who might ask questions. She'd created the perfect crime. "I already have gotten away with it. 3 times. She raised the syringe. "You're just number 4. The casual way she said it, like I was an item on a grocery list, sent rage flooding through my terror. I wasn't just going to die. I was going to become a statistic in her murder spree, another elderly woman whose death enriched her bank account. But I was still alive, still breathing, still capable of fighting back. "You made one mistake," I said, backing toward the kitchen knives. "And what's that?" "You assumed I'd be easy to kill." There was no going back now. The syringe caught the light as she stepped closer, and something inside me snapped. Not broke, snapped into place, like a bone setting after being fractured for months. I wasn't going to die today. Not like this. Not as victim number 4 in her collection of murdered friends. "You know what your real mistake was, Diane?" I moved sideways, keeping the kitchen island between us. "You got greedy. 3 murders should have been enough for anyone." "It's never enough." She followed my movement, syringe held like a weapon. "Do you have any idea what it's like to watch weak people waste money they don't deserve? To see them squander resources while I struggle to make ends meet?" The entitlement in her voice made my chest burn. She'd convinced herself that murdering lonely women was some kind of public service, that we deserved to die for having more than she did. "You struggled?" I laughed, but it came out harsh. "You drove a BMW, Diane. You wore designer clothes. You went on cruises twice a year. Paid for with their money. Money they would have wasted on medical bills and nursing homes." She circled closer. "I put it to better use." "Their money." She didn't even see her victims as people anymore. We were just bank accounts with inconvenient heartbeats attached. For 20 years, I'd trusted this woman with my deepest fears. I'd cried on her shoulder when my husband died. I'd let her hold my hand through chemotherapy sessions, believing she cared whether I lived or died. Every comfort she'd offered had been calculation. Every moment of supposed friendship had been her studying me, learning my weaknesses, planning my death. The betrayal should have broken me. 3 hours ago, discovering her research had left me sobbing in my car. But standing here, watching her prepare to inject poison into my veins, I felt something harder than heartbreak crystallizing in my chest. Rage. Pure, clean, righteous fury. She'd stolen years of my life already. The slow poisoning, the manufactured setbacks in my treatment, the deliberate weakening of my body while she played devoted caregiver. She'd robbed me of months of healing, of strength, of hope. She'd made me doubt my own recovery, question whether I was strong enough to beat cancer. But I had beaten it. Despite her interference, despite her attempts to speed my death, my body had fought back. I was alive, getting stronger every day, and she couldn't stand it. The other women, I said, still moving around the island. Did they fight back when they realized what you were doing? They never realized. That's what made them perfect victims. Her eyes glittered with satisfaction. They died trusting me completely, grateful for my care right up to the end. The casual pride in her voice made my hands clench into fists. She was bragging about how thoroughly she'd deceived dying women, how completely she'd betrayed their trust before murdering them. But you're different, she continued. Too suspicious, too stubborn to die quietly. You've made this much more complicated than it needed to be. Good. I was glad I'd made her life difficult. Glad I'd survived long enough to see her true face. The other women had died believing they were loved. At least I knew exactly who was trying to kill me. You want to know what makes me different, Diane? I reached behind me and found what I was looking for, the knife block. I'm not grateful for your care. I'm furious about it. My fingers closed around a handle, 8-inch chef's knife, sharp enough to slice through bone, heavy enough to do real damage if I needed it to. Put that down, Barbara. You're not a killer. Neither were you, until you started practicing on lonely old women. I pulled the knife free, felt its weight in my hand. But we all learn new skills when we have to. She stopped moving, reassessing. The syringe was still raised, but she was calculating distances now, wondering if she could reach me before I could strike. You think you can fight me? You're 58 years old and recovering from cancer. I'm younger, stronger, and I've done this before. You've murdered sick women who trusted you? That's not the same as fighting someone who knows what you are. I shifted my grip on the knife, remembering lessons from a self-defense class I'd taken years ago. I may be older, but I'm not weak, and I'm definitely not trusting. For the first time since she'd revealed her plan, uncertainty flickered across her face. She'd expected me to collapse in tears, to beg for my life, to make this easy for her. Instead, I was armed and angry and ready to make her bleed for what she'd done. Barbara, be reasonable. Put the knife down, and this can still look like natural causes. Keep fighting, and I'll have to make it messier, harder to explain. I don't care how it looks. The words came out steady, stronger than I'd felt in months. I care about making sure you never do this to anyone else. She lunged then, syringe aimed for my neck, but I'd been watching her eyes, reading her body language the way she'd read mine for 20 years. I saw the attack coming and stepped aside, slashing with the knife as she passed. The blade caught her wrist, and she screamed. The syringe flew across the kitchen, hit the wall, shattered. Whatever poison she'd prepared for me spread across the floor in a puddle of broken glass. Blood ran down her arm, and she stared at the wound like she couldn't believe I'd actually cut her. Like the idea that I might fight back had never seriously occurred to her. "You stabbed me!" She clutched her wrist, trying to stop the bleeding. "I defended myself. There's a difference." I kept the knife raised, ready for another attack. The same way those other women should have been able to defend themselves if they'd known what you really were. She backed toward the sliding door, but I moved to block her path. If she got outside, she might escape, might disappear, and start over somewhere else with new victims. I couldn't let that happen. "This isn't over, Barbara. Even if you kill me, my partner will come looking. He'll finish what I started." "Your partner can try. But first, you and I are going to have a conversation about exactly how many women you've murdered and where you've hidden the evidence." She pressed against the glass door, trapped between me and the wall. For the first time, she looked genuinely afraid. The predator had become prey, and she didn't know how to handle the reversal. "You can't prove anything. It's your word against mine, and who's going to believe a sick old woman over a respected nurse?" "The police will believe the evidence I found in your house. The research, the insurance policies, the detailed plans." I smiled, and it felt sharp as the blade in my hand. "Did you really think I came here just to confront you? I documented everything, Diane. Every file, every document, every piece of proof that you're a serial killer." Her face went white. She hadn't considered that I might be smart enough to gather evidence before confronting her, that I might have learned from her own careful planning. "Where are the copies?" she whispered. "Safe, along with a detailed letter explaining everything I discovered, addressed to the police." I hadn't actually written such a letter yet, but she didn't need to know that. If something happens to me, they'll know exactly where to look and what to look for. It was a bluff, but it worked. She slumped against the door, the fight going out of her. Without the element of surprise, without her victim's trust and ignorance, she was just another middle-aged woman who'd gotten in over her head. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want you to confess. I want the names of every woman you've killed. I want to know where you've hidden their stolen money. And I want you to understand that your killing spree is over." She looked at the knife in my hand, at the blood still dripping from her wrist, at my face that no longer showed any trace of the trusting friend she'd manipulated for 2 decades. "You've changed," she said quietly. "You tried to murder me. Of course I've changed." I felt the truth of it settling into my bones. The woman who'd walked into this house 3 hours ago, scared, betrayed, broken, was gone. In her place stood someone harder, someone who'd looked death in the face and decided to fight back. "I'm not the same person who signed that will, Diane. I'm not the grateful cancer patient who let you into my home and my life. I'm the woman who survived your murder attempt and lived to tell about it. Tomorrow, everything changes. Tonight, I was finally ready to take my life back." The knife trembled in my grip as I stared at the woman I'd called my best friend for 20 years. Blood from her wrist dripped onto my kitchen floor, each drop marking the death of everything I'd believed about us. "You took everything from me." The words came out raw, scraped from somewhere deep in my chest. She stepped backward, pressing herself harder against the sliding glass door. Guilt was written across every line of her face, in the way her shoulders curved inward, in how she couldn't meet my eyes. I didn't mean for it to go this far. But it did, and now there's no going back. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Outside, rain had started falling, drumming against the windows with increasing intensity. The sound filled the space where our friendship used to live. I could smell the metallic scent of her blood mixing with the lingering aroma of the coffee we'd shared just hours ago. Back when I still trusted her, still believed she cared about my recovery. My chest burned with the effort of breathing normally. Every inhale felt like swallowing broken glass. This was Diane. Diane who'd held my hand during chemo. Diane who'd brought me soup when I was too weak to cook. Diane who'd listened to me cry about dying and promised everything would be okay. 20 years? I whispered. 20 years of friendship, and it was all just... What? A long game? Were you planning this from the beginning? She flinched like I'd struck her. No, Barbara, you have to believe me. It started as genuine friendship. I cared about you. I still care about you. Cared about me? My voice cracked, and I hated how broken I sounded. You researched ways to poison me. You convinced me to write a will leaving you everything. You were going to murder me and make it look like the cancer came back. Her injured hand clutched at her chest, leaving a smear of blood on her white blouse. The same blouse she'd worn to my last oncology appointment, sitting beside me while the doctor delivered good news about my remission. I remembered feeling so grateful to have her there, so blessed to have a friend who cared enough to take time off work. The memory made my stomach lurch. Had she been disappointed by the doctor's positive report? Had she been hoping for worse news? It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. When you first got sick, I really was just trying to help. But then I saw how much money you had, how isolated you'd become, and You saw an opportunity. The knife felt heavier in my hand, its weight anchoring me to reality. You saw a sick woman with no family and dollar signs. She pressed her lips together, and for a moment I saw a flash of the calculating predator she really was. The mask slipping just enough to reveal the coldness underneath. You don't understand what it's like, Barbara. I've worked my whole life and have nothing to show for it. Nothing saved for retirement, no security, no future. I watch people die every day at the hospital, and most of them leave everything to ungrateful children who waste it. So you decided to help yourself. My throat felt raw, like I'd been screaming for hours. How many others, Diane? How many lonely, sick women trusted you with their lives? The question hung in the air like smoke. I watched her face carefully, saw the moment she decided whether to lie or finally tell the truth. Her shoulders sagged, and she looked older than I'd ever seen her look. 3, she whispered. Before you, all terminal patients, all alone. The number hit me like a physical blow. 3 women who'd died believing someone cared about them. 3 families who'd grieved natural deaths that were actually murders. 3 lives stolen by the woman I'd considered my closest friend. I thought about the files I'd found in her house. Insurance policies, medical records, detailed notes about each victim's assets and family situations. She'd been methodical, patient, professional in her killing. This wasn't passion or desperation. This was business. Their names, I demanded. I want their names. Barbara, please, this doesn't have to... Their names. I raised the knife slightly, and she flinched. Margaret Collins, 73, pancreatic cancer. Sarah Winston, 68, lung cancer. Helen Torres, 55, brain tumor. Each name landed like a stone in my chest. Real women, real lives. I pictured them in their final days, weak and scared and grateful for Diane's gentle care, trusting her completely as she slowly poisoned them. How? The word came out as a croak. Insulin, mostly. Small doses over time. Looks like natural decline, especially in cancer patients. Easy to explain away. She said it so matter-of-factly, like she was discussing a medical procedure rather than describing how she'd murdered 3 innocent women. The casual tone made my skin crawl. And me? What were you planning for me? The same. You were already weak from treatment, already experiencing fatigue and confusion. A few missed doses of your medication, some carefully timed insulin injections. Your body was already compromised. No one would have questioned it. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the world outside my kitchen window into a blur of gray. I could hear water rushing through the gutters, carrying away everything in its path. That's what Diane had planned for me. To be washed away, forgotten. Just another cancer victim who'd fought hard, but ultimately lost. You held my hand, I said quietly. When I was getting chemo, you held my hand and told me I was going to beat this. I meant it then. Her voice was small, defeated. I really did want you to recover, but then your condition improved and the will was already written and I couldn't stop thinking about the money. So you decided to help the cancer along. She nodded, tears finally starting to fall. But I felt no sympathy for her. Those tears were for herself, for getting caught, not for the women she'd killed or the pain she'd caused. The syringe, I said. What was in it? Concentrated insulin, enough to send you into diabetic coma within minutes. I would have called 911, performed CPR until the paramedics arrived. Grieving friend who tried desperately to save you, but couldn't. I could picture it perfectly. Diane sobbing over my body, playing the devastated friend for the EMTs and police. Maybe she would have spoken at my funeral, shared touching memories of our friendship, while secretly planning how to spend my inheritance. The thought made rage surge through me, hot and clean and clarifying. This woman had stolen my trust, my money, my future. She'd planned to steal my life itself, and the only reason I was still breathing was pure luck, walking in at the right moment to see her true face. You practiced, I realized. The grief, the shock, the innocent act. You've done this before. I had to be convincing. She wiped her eyes with her uninjured hand, smearing tears with blood. If anyone suspected, they'd investigate, find the pattern, discover that Nurse Diane was present for an unusual number of unexpected deaths. She nodded miserably. I was careful. Never more than 1 patient per year. Always different hospitals, different circumstances. I moved around, took travel assignments to avoid suspicion. The scope of her planning was staggering. This wasn't impulse or desperation. This was a career, a systematic approach to murder that she'd refined over years of practice. And I'd invited her into my home, into my most vulnerable moments, completely oblivious to what she really was. The other women, I said. Did they suspect? At the end? No. Her voice was barely a whisper. They trusted me completely. They died grateful for my care. That was somehow worse than if they'd known. To die believing you were loved when you were actually being murdered. To spend your final moments feeling blessed to have such a devoted friend. I looked at Diane, really looked at her, and tried to find any trace of the woman I'd loved like a sister. But all I could see was the predator who'd worn my friend's face for 20 years, the stranger who'd held my hand while planning my death. Everything I knew was a lie, I said, and the words tasted like ash in my mouth. Every conversation, every shared moment, every time you said you cared about me, all of it was just you setting up the kill. She opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off. Don't tell me part of it was real. Don't tell me you actually cared. You can't care about someone and plan to murder them for money. You can't love someone and research the best ways to poison them. The rain was a steady roar now, drowning out everything except the sound of my own heartbeat. I felt hollow, scraped clean of everything I'd believed about friendship and trust and human decency. The woman I'd been this morning, the grateful cancer survivor with a loving best friend, was as dead as if Diane had succeeded with her syringe. But in her place stood someone harder, someone who'd looked pure evil in the face and lived to tell about it. Someone who would make sure Diane never got the chance to practice her deadly compassion on anyone else. The knife was steady in my hand now. My fear had burned away, leaving only cold determination. Whatever happened next, Diane's killing spree was over, and she was finally going to pay for what she'd done. The knife trembled in my grip as I stared at Diane's bloodied form slumped against my kitchen cabinets. Her confession hung in the air like poison, but something nagged at me. 20 years of friendship couldn't have been entirely fabricated. There had to be more, evidence of when this started, how long she'd been planning, what else she'd hidden from me. "Stay there," I commanded, though she was in no condition to move with her wounded hand pressed against her chest. "Don't even think about getting up." I backed toward her purse, which sat innocently on my counter where she'd placed it hours earlier. The same black leather bag she'd carried for years, filled with what I'd always assumed were normal things: wallet, keys, makeup, the usual clutter of a woman's life. Now I wondered what secrets it actually contained. My fingers found the zipper and pulled it open. Inside, everything looked normal at first glance. Her wallet sat on top, worn brown leather with family photos visible through the plastic sleeves. But underneath, my hand touched something unexpected. A small spiral notebook, the kind reporters use. I pulled it out with shaking fingers. The cover was unmarked, completely plain. When I opened it, my heart stopped. The first page contained a detailed schedule. My schedule. Not just the obvious appointments like doctor visits and chemo sessions, but everything. What time I usually woke up, when I went grocery shopping, my walking routine, my medication times, even when I typically went to bed. She'd been watching me, cataloging my life like I was a lab rat in an experiment. I flipped the page, and my stomach dropped further. More notes, written in Diane's neat nursing handwriting. Barbara more trusting on Wednesdays after chemo. Fatigue makes her less suspicious. Below that, key hidden under fake rock by front door, could access house anytime. The room started spinning. She'd known about my spare key for years. Had she been coming into my house when I wasn't here? Going through my things? The thought made my skin crawl with violation. Another page showed a timeline stretching back months. March, suggested will revision during vulnerable moment post-diagnosis. April, reinforced fears about family fighting over inheritance. May, positioned self as only trustworthy option for estate management. Each entry was a manipulation I remembered but hadn't recognized. Conversations where she gently steered me toward decisions that served her purposes. Moments of comfort that were actually calculated moves in a long game I hadn't even known we were playing. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the notebook steady. I forced myself to keep reading, even though each revelation felt like another knife wound. June. B's cancer responding well to treatment. May need to accelerate timeline. The clinical detachment in those words made bile rise in my throat. She'd been disappointed by my recovery. While I celebrated each clean scan and good blood count, she was recalculating her murder schedule. July. Researched insulin dosages for non-diabetics. Gradual approach safest. Build up tolerance slowly. Below that were numbers, calculations, dosage charts like she was planning medication for a patient instead of plotting to kill her best friend. I sank into a chair, the notebook clutched against my chest. 20 years. Had any of it been real? Our late-night phone calls when I couldn't sleep through the pain? The times she'd driven me to appointments when I was too weak to go alone? The day she'd held me while I cried about losing my hair? All of it contaminated now. Every memory poisoned by the knowledge of what she'd really been thinking, what she'd really been planning. But there was more. I could see additional pages, and some sick part of me needed to know everything. I needed to understand the full scope of what she'd done to me. The next section made my blood freeze. It wasn't about me at all. Helen Morrison, stage 4 lung cancer, very isolated, substantial savings. Below that, a timeline similar to mine. Helen's routines, her vulnerabilities, her trust-building moments. Then, in red ink, completed August 2019. Helen Morrison. I'd heard Diane mention that name before, always with sadness. A patient she'd grown close to who died suddenly from complications. Except now I knew the truth. Helen hadn't died from complications. She'd been murdered. I turned the page with trembling fingers. Margaret Chen, breast cancer survivor, recent divorce, inherited family business. Another timeline. Another systematic destruction of trust. Another red notation. Completed February 2021. Then, Susan Williams, ovarian cancer, no children, wealthy widow. The timeline was shorter here, more rushed. Completed September 2022. 3 women, 3 murders. 3 lives stolen for money that Diane had no right to claim. And I was supposed to be number 4 in this grotesque collection. But it got worse. At the bottom of Susan's page, Diane had written notes about mistakes she'd made, things to improve for next time. She was learning from each murder, refining her technique, becoming more efficient at destroying lives. Susan became suspicious near the end, was asking questions about previous patients. Need better emotional manipulation for future targets. Consider building longer friendship foundation before inheritance discussions. Future targets. Plural. I wasn't going to be her last victim. I was just another stepping stone in a career of murder that she planned to continue for years to come. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. The scope of Diane's deception wasn't just about me or my money. It was about a systematic pattern of predatory behavior that had already claimed 3 innocent lives and would have continued claiming more. I flipped to the back of the notebook, desperate to see if there were other names, other potential victims she'd already identified. What I found was worse than more victim lists. There were pages of research, medical journals photocopied and annotated, articles about insulin overdoses and their symptoms, studies on how cancer treatments could mask the signs of other medical interventions. She'd turned murder into a science, complete with research and methodology. One article was highlighted extensively. Undetected insulin administration in non-diabetic patients, a case study in misdiagnosed cause of death. In the margins, Diane had written notes like, perfect for weakened cancer patients, and symptoms easily attributed to treatment side effects. She'd studied my disease to figure out how to kill me more effectively. Used my cancer as cover for her murder plot. The violation was so complete, so thorough, that I felt like I was drowning in it. But there was one more section that made everything else pale in comparison. At the very back of the notebook, I found photocopies of legal documents. Wills, insurance policies, bank statements. Not just mine. All 4 of us. Helen, Margaret, Susan, and me. She'd kept copies of everything, like trophies from her kills. Helen Morrison had left everything to my dear friend Diane, the only person who truly cared for me in my final days. The will was dated just 3 weeks before Helen's death. Margaret Chen's will was similar. To Diane Phillips, my devoted friend and caregiver, who showed me such kindness during the darkest period of my life. Susan Williams had been even more generous. Diane has been like a daughter to me. I leave my entire estate to her, knowing she will use it wisely and remember me fondly. All of them. All of these women had rewritten their wills to benefit Diane in their final months of life. Just like I had. The same language, the same emotional manipulation, the same deadly outcome. Except Susan's will had never been executed. According to the notes, she died before she could sign the final version. Diane had gotten impatient, moved too quickly, and lost out on the full inheritance. That's why she'd waited so long with me. Learning from her mistake, making sure everything was perfectly in place before she made her move. I was supposed to be her biggest payday yet. My house, my savings, my life insurance, everything I'd worked for over nearly 6 decades. All of it was going to fund whatever luxurious retirement she'd planned for herself. The notebook slipped from my numb fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud. I stared at Diane, who was watching me with desperate, calculating eyes. Even now, even caught and wounded and exposed, I could see her mind working, looking for angles, for ways to minimize the damage, for escape routes. "How much?" I asked, my voice hoarse with grief and rage. "How much money have you stolen from dead women?" She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. The evidence was right there in her careful notes, her meticulous planning, her cold calculations. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more. Enough to justify 3 murders and nearly a 4th. "You turned friendship into a weapon," I said, the words coming out raw and broken. "You found lonely, sick women and made them love you so you could kill them and steal everything they'd worked for." My hands were shaking uncontrollably now. The full weight of what I'd discovered was crushing me. This wasn't just about betrayal or greed. This was about a predator who'd spent years perfecting the art of emotional manipulation and murder. A monster who wore the face of compassion while calculating the best ways to destroy the people who trusted her. I looked around my kitchen, the same room where Diane had sat countless times, drinking my coffee, eating my food, listening to my fears and hopes and dreams, all while planning to kill me and take everything I owned. There was more. So much more I didn't know. The notebook lay open between us like a confession written in blood. I looked at Diane, really looked at her, and saw not my best friend of 8 years, but a calculating predator who'd been studying me like prey since the day we met. "You kept records," I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "Helen Morrison, Margaret Chen, Susan Williams, 3 women you murdered for their money." Diane's face went pale, but her eyes stayed sharp, alert. Even now, she was calculating her next move. "Barbara, you're sick. The cancer treatments are making you paranoid. You need help." I picked up the notebook and held it between us like a shield. Insulin overdoses disguised as cancer complications. Emotional manipulation techniques refined with each kill. Future target lists. My voice got stronger with each word. "You documented everything, Diane. Your own personal murder manual." "You can't prove anything," she said, but her confidence was cracking around the edges. I could see sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool morning air. "I don't need to prove anything." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, showing her the screen. "I already did." The blood drained completely from her face. On my phone was a photo of the notebook's most damning page, the one with Susan Williams' will and Diane's notes about improving technique for future targets. Below that was a text message thread showing I'd already sent the photo to someone. Who did you send that to? Her voice came out as a whisper. Detective Morrison with the county police. Helen Morrison's nephew. Turns out, he never believed his aunt died of natural causes. I kept my tone conversational, like we were discussing the weather. He's been investigating her death for 2 years, waiting for evidence. Diane's knees buckled slightly. She gripped the kitchen counter to keep from falling. You don't understand? Those women were dying anyway. I helped them transition peacefully. They wanted to leave me their money. They were grateful. Grateful. The word tasted like poison in my mouth. Susan Williams was so grateful, she tried to back out of changing her will. That's why you killed her before she could sign the final version. That's why you only got part of her estate instead of everything. Her mask was completely gone now. The warm, caring friend I'd known for 8 years had vanished, replaced by something cold and desperate. You're making a mistake, Barbara. I'm the only person who's been there for you through this cancer. I'm the only one who cares about you. You cared about my bank account, my life insurance policy, my house. I stepped closer to her, and she actually flinched away from me. You spent months learning my routines, my vulnerabilities, my fears. You documented when I was weakest, when I'd be easiest to kill. The sound of car doors slamming outside made us both freeze. Through the kitchen window, I could see 2 police vehicles pulling into my driveway. Red and blue lights painted my walls in harsh, rotating colors. They're here, I said simply. Diane's composure shattered completely. Barbara, please, we can work this out. I can explain everything. Those other women, they were lonely. They had no family. Their money would have just gone to the state. At least this way it went to someone who actually spent time with them. Someone who murdered them? I made their final days comfortable. I was there when no one else cared. Her voice was rising to a panicky shriek. I gave them friendship, companionship, love. Real love. You gave them insulin overdoses. Heavy footsteps echoed on my front porch. The doorbell rang, followed immediately by authoritative knocking. Police! Open up! I started toward the front door, but Diane grabbed my arm. Her fingers dug into my skin with desperate strength. Don't do this! You're signing my death warrant. I'll get life in prison. Is that what you want? To destroy the only real friend you've ever had? I looked down at her hand on my arm, then back at her face. For just a moment, I saw a flash of the woman I'd trusted with my deepest fears. The woman who'd held my hand during chemo sessions. The woman who'd made me laugh when I thought I was dying. Then I remembered Helen Morrison, alone and trusting in her final moments. Margaret Chen, grateful for what she thought was kindness. Susan Williams, growing suspicious too late to save herself. You were never my friend, I said, pulling my arm free. You were my executioner. The knocking got louder, more insistent. This is the police. We need to speak with Barbara Jenkins. I walked to the front door and opened it. 2 detectives stood on my porch. A tall black man with kind eyes and a shorter white woman with steel gray hair. Behind them, I could see uniformed officers positioning themselves around my property. Ms. Jenkins? I'm Detective Morrison. We got your message about evidence in my aunt's death. It's all in the kitchen, I said, stepping aside to let them in. She's still here, along with everything you need to prove what she did. Detective Morrison's partner moved past me quickly, hand resting on her weapon. Ma'am, step away from the counter and put your hands where I can see them. I followed them back to the kitchen, watching as Diane's world collapsed around her. She stood frozen by the sink, the notebook still open on the floor where I'd dropped it. Her face had gone completely gray, like all the life had drained out of her. Diane Phillips? Detective Morrison's voice was professionally calm, but I could hear the edge underneath. You're under arrest for the murder of Helen Morrison. This is a misunderstanding, Diane said weakly. Barbara is sick. She's not thinking clearly. The female detective was already photographing the notebook with her phone. Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. I watched them cuff her, read her rights, document the evidence. Through it all, Diane kept looking at me with this expression of wounded betrayal, like I was the one who'd done something unforgivable, like I'd broken some sacred trust between us. You don't understand what you're doing, she said as they led her toward the door. I loved you, Barbara. I really did. Everything I did was to take care of you. You loved my money, I replied. The rest was just good acting. The door closed behind them with a soft click. Through the window, I watched them put Diane in the back of the police car. She was crying now, her careful composure completely destroyed. For a moment, she looked exactly like what she was, a middle-aged woman who'd made terrible choices and was finally facing the consequences. But then I thought about her notebook, the clinical way she'd documented each woman's weaknesses, the methodical planning that had gone into each murder, the way she'd refined her technique with each kill, learning from her mistakes to become more efficient. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. This was a business, a career built on the corpses of lonely, vulnerable women who trusted her with their final days. My phone rang. Detective Morrison's voice was warm, but professional. Ms. Jenkins, we'll need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. But I want you to know, you probably saved lives today. We found evidence linking her to at least 2 other suspicious deaths in neighboring counties. Women who changed their wills right before dying of apparent medical complications. 5 women. Maybe more. All dead because they'd made the mistake of trusting Diane Phillips with their loneliness and fear. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where Diane and I had shared hundreds of meals and conversations. The same table where she'd convinced me to change my will for safekeeping. The same table where she'd planned to celebrate my death while inheriting everything I'd worked for. The house felt different now. Cleaner. Like a poison had been drawn out of the air itself. For the first time in months, I could breathe freely without feeling like someone was watching me, calculating my weaknesses, planning my demise. It was done. No turning back. The woman I'd trusted with my life had been revealed as my would-be killer. And now, she was facing the justice she'd avoided for far too long. But as I sat there in the sudden silence, I realized something that chilled me more than all of Diane's careful planning. If I hadn't gotten sick that morning, if I hadn't stumbled into her house at exactly the wrong moment, I would have died believing she loved me. I would have gone to my grave, grateful for her friendship, never knowing that every kindness had been calculated. Every moment of comfort had been a lie designed to make my murder easier. How many women had died that way? Grateful and trusting, holding the hand of their killer in their final moments? The question would haunt me for the rest of my life. But at least now, I would have a rest of my life to be haunted by it. That had to be enough. The detective's car pulled away, taking Diane into a future that would be very different from the one she'd planned. I stood at my window watching until the taillights disappeared around the corner, then slowly made my way back to the kitchen. The notebook still lay open on the floor. I picked it up, flipping through pages of meticulous surveillance notes about my daily routines. Barbara takes morning walk at 7:15 a.m. Always stops to pet the neighbor's cat. Vulnerable spot. No witnesses for 3 blocks. The handwriting was so familiar, the same careful script that had signed birthday cards and thank you notes for 23 years. My legs suddenly felt weak. I sank into my chair, the full weight of what had just happened crashing over me like a wave. The woman who'd held my hand through chemotherapy treatments had been planning to poison me. The friend who'd brought me soup when I was sick had been documenting my weaknesses to exploit them. Detective Morrison returned an hour later with a small team. They worked quietly, professionally, photographing evidence and bagging items I'd never noticed before. A small vial tucked behind my spice rack. Pills that looked exactly like my prescription medication, but weren't. A spare key to my house that I'd never given her. "How long do you think she was planning this?" I asked Detective Morrison as his team finished their work. He looked up from Diane's notebook, his expression grim. "Based on these notes, at least 6 months, maybe longer. She was very thorough." 6 months. While I was fighting for my life against cancer, grateful for every moment of her support, she was planning my death. The irony was so bitter I could taste it. "The other women," I said quietly. "How did she choose them?" Detective Morrison's jaw tightened. "Lonely, wealthy, no close family. Usually dealing with health issues that would make a sudden death seem natural." He paused, studying my face carefully. "You fit the profile perfectly. That's not a coincidence." The words hit me like a physical blow. Our friendship hadn't been real. It had been a hunting strategy. Every shared laugh, every moment of comfort, every tear she'd wiped from my cheek, all of it had been performance designed to position herself for the kill. Did she ever care about me at all? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Detective Morrison closed the notebook gently. "Ma'am, in my experience, people like Diane Phillips don't form genuine attachments. They identify targets and play whatever role will get them what they want. I'm sorry." After they left, I called my nephew David. He lived 3 states away, and we only talked a few times a year, but hearing his voice suddenly felt essential. "Aunt Barbara, is everything okay? You sound upset." I found myself crying before I could answer. Not the quiet tears I'd shed during my illness, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere I'd kept locked away for months. "I'm okay now," I managed finally. I needed to hear a real voice. Someone who actually cares about me." "Of course I care about you. Your family. What happened?" I told him everything. The whole impossible story spilled out of me. The will, the surveillance, the notebook, the arrest. David listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of shock or disgust. "Jesus, Aunt Barbara, you could have been killed if you hadn't gotten sick that morning." "I know." The thought would probably wake me up at night for years to come. I keep thinking about how close I came, how grateful I would have been to her, right up until the end. "But you didn't die," David said firmly. "You figured it out. You stopped her. And now she can't hurt anyone else." That evening, I sat in my garden as the sun set. The roses I'd planted were blooming beautifully, their scent filling the warm air. Diane had complimented them just last week, suggesting we have tea out here sometime soon. I wondered now if she'd been calculating how quickly the neighbors would find my body if I collapsed among my own flowers. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "This is Detective Morrison. Diane Phillips has been charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. Her arraignment is next week. Thank you for your courage today." 5 women, 5 lives stolen by someone who'd perfected the art of appearing trustworthy. I thought about Helen Morrison, who'd probably died believing she was surrounded by love. About Margaret Chen and Susan Williams and the two others whose names I didn't even know yet. All of them betrayed by the same gentle smile, the same caring voice, the same careful hands that had held mine during my darkest moments. The next morning, I drove to the courthouse. I needed to see Diane one more time, needed to look her in the eye now that all pretenses were gone. The arraignment was brief and formal. Diane sat between two public defenders, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made her look smaller and older than I'd ever seen her. When the judge read the charges, Diane's shoulders sagged. First-degree murder. 5 counts, fraud, conspiracy. Each word seemed to hit her like a physical blow. This was real now. No more games, no more manipulation, no more careful performances. As they led her away, she turned and looked directly at me. For just a moment, I saw something in her eyes that might have been genuine emotion. Regret, maybe. Or just fear of what was coming. Why? I mouthed the words silently. She shook her head slightly, then looked away. The bailiff guided her through the door, and she was gone. Outside the courthouse, Detective Morrison found me sitting on a bench, staring at the traffic passing by. "How are you holding up, Miss Jenkins?" "I keep thinking I should feel triumphant," I said. "Like I won something. But mostly, I just feel empty. 23 years of friendship, and none of it was real." He sat down beside me. "The friendship you felt was real. Your loyalty, your trust, your care for her. That was all genuine. The fact that she couldn't return it doesn't diminish what you gave." "But how do I trust anyone again? How do I know when someone actually cares about me versus when they're just calculating my net worth?" Detective Morrison was quiet for a moment. "You don't," he said finally. "Trust is always a risk, but the alternative is living alone, and that's not really living at all." I thought about David's voice on the phone last night, warm with genuine concern. About my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who'd brought me groceries during chemo without being asked. About Dr. Martinez, who'd stayed late to explain my treatment options in terms I could understand. Real care did exist. I'd just been unlucky enough to mistake a predator for a friend. 3 months later, I received a letter from the district attorney's office. Diane had accepted a plea bargain. Life in prison without parole in exchange for providing information about 2 additional murders they hadn't been able to prove. 7 women total. 7 families who would finally have answers about their mothers, sisters, friends. I never wrote back to Diane, though she sent me several letters from prison. I threw them away unopened. Whatever she wanted to say to me now, I didn't need to hear it. The time for her words had passed. Instead, I started volunteering at the cancer center where I'd received my treatment. I sat with patients who had no one else, held hands during scary procedures, brought books and magazines to people spending long days in chemotherapy chairs. Real friendship, offered freely with no ulterior motives. It felt good to give without calculating what I might receive in return. It felt good to trust my instincts again, to believe that most people were exactly who they appeared to be. Diane Phillips had been the exception, not the rule. On the first anniversary of her arrest, I planted a new rose bush in my garden. Not for her, but for Helen Morrison and the others whose names I now knew by heart. Women who died believing they were loved, never knowing they'd been hunted. The roses bloomed beautifully that summer, filling my garden with color and life. Sometimes I sat among them in the evening, grateful for every breath, every sunset, every moment I'd been given that Diane had tried to steal. Justice had been served. The predator was caged. The other potential victims were safe. It was over. Resolution: standin' strong. 2 years later, I woke up in my new apartment on the other side of town. The morning light streamed through windows I'd chosen myself, in a place Diane had never set foot. I made my coffee in a kitchen she'd never studied. Sat at a table she'd never calculated the value of. Everything here was mine alone, untainted by her presence or her plans. The coffee tasted better somehow. Maybe because I was drinking it in complete safety, or maybe because I'd finally learned to appreciate the simple act of being alive to taste it at all. My phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor Elena. "Garden club meeting at 10. You bringing those amazing cookies?" I smiled and typed back yes. Elena was 82 years old, sharp as a tack, and had absolutely no interest in my financial situation. She cared about my chocolate chip recipe and my opinion on roses. Real friendship built on genuine connection rather than careful calculation. The garden club had become one of my favorite parts of the week. 8 women ranging from 35 to 87, all of us passionate about growing things. We shared seeds and stories, complained about aphids, and celebrated successful harvests. Nobody asked about my will or suggested I needed help managing my affairs. They just wanted to know if my tomatoes were ripening and whether I'd tried the new organic fertilizer. I got dressed and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was different from the one Diane had targeted. Stronger. More careful, but not fearful. I'd learned the difference between healthy caution and paralyzing suspicion. I trusted people now, but I trusted my instincts more. The doorbell rang. Elena stood on my porch holding a bag of fresh herbs from her garden. "Basil for your cookies," she said, "and because I had too much and hate to waste it." "Thank you." I took the bag, inhaling the fresh scent. "Want some coffee before we head over?" "Always." She followed me into the kitchen, settling into the chair by the window. "You know, Barbara, you seem happier these days, more settled." I poured her coffee and considered her words. "I think I finally figured out who I am when nobody's trying to manipulate me." Elena nodded knowingly. "It takes some people a lifetime to learn that lesson. You're lucky you figured it out while you still had time to enjoy it." At the garden club meeting, we discussed plans for the community garden project. The city had donated a vacant lot, and we were transforming it into a space where anyone could grow vegetables and flowers. I'd volunteered to coordinate the rose section, drawing on everything I'd learned from my own garden. "Barbara knows more about roses than anyone," said Maria, our club president. "Her garden is absolutely stunning." I felt a warm flush of pride. My garden was stunning now. I'd replanted it completely after Diane's arrest, choosing varieties based on what I loved rather than what might impress visitors. The result was a riot of color and fragrance that brought me genuine joy every morning. After the meeting, I stopped by the cancer center for my volunteer shift. I'd been coming here for 18 months now, and it had become as important to me as any job I'd ever had. Today, I was reading to Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman going through her second round of chemotherapy. "How are you feeling today?" I asked, settling into the chair beside her treatment bed. "Tired," she said, "but grateful. My daughter wanted to take time off work to be here, but I told her you'd keep me company." I opened the book we'd been reading together, a mystery novel she'd chosen. As I read, I watched her face relax. This was real care, freely given and gratefully received. No hidden agendas, no calculations, no manipulation. Just one human being helping another through a difficult time. "You have such a soothing voice," Mrs. Chen said during a break. "Have you always been good at taking care of people?" I considered the question. I thought I was. But I think I was mostly good at being taken care of, or at least at letting people convince me I needed their help. I'm learning the difference. "Good for you," she said firmly. Independence is precious, especially for women our age. That evening, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine and my journal. I'd started writing again after Diane's arrest. Not about the trauma, but about the rebuilding. The small victories, the moments of joy, the gradual return of trust in myself and others. Today, Elena brought me basil, I wrote. Such a simple gesture, but it made me think about how real kindness feels different from performed kindness. Elena doesn't watch my face to see if I'm grateful enough. She doesn't mention how much the herbs cost or hint that I owe her something in return. She just saw something beautiful in her garden and wanted to share it. My phone rang. David, calling for our weekly check-in. He'd been incredibly supportive during the trial and aftermath, never pushing but always available when I needed to talk. "How was your day?" he asked. "Good, really good. I helped coordinate the community garden project, read to a patient at the cancer center, and Elena brought me herbs for no reason except kindness." "You sound happy," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I am happy. Not the manic kind of happiness I used to perform for Diane, but genuine contentment. I like my life now." "You've earned it, Barbara. After everything you went through, you've earned every moment of peace." After we hung up, I walked through my house, appreciating the quiet. No footsteps I hadn't invited, no conversations I hadn't chosen, no presence that made me second-guess my instincts. The solitude felt luxurious rather than lonely. I thought about Diane sometimes, wondering how she was adapting to prison life. The manipulative charm that had served her so well in the outside world would be useless behind bars. She was probably struggling to form any genuine connections, having never learned how to relate to people without an ulterior motive. I didn't feel sorry for her. She'd made her choices, calculated and deliberate, over years of careful planning. 7 women had died because of those choices. 7 families had been destroyed. The justice system had given her exactly what she deserved, but I also didn't waste energy hating her anymore. Hate was just another way of letting her control my thoughts and emotions. I'd chosen something better: indifference. She was irrelevant to my life now, a cautionary tale that had taught me valuable lessons about trust and self-reliance. The next morning, I received an envelope in the mail with the return address of a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a letter from an attorney representing the families of Diane's victims. They were filing a civil lawsuit against her estate and wanted to know if I'd be willing to testify about her methods of manipulation. I called the attorney and agreed to help. Not because I wanted revenge, but because other families deserved to understand what had happened to their loved ones. They needed to know that their mothers and sisters hadn't been foolish or naive, but had been targeted by a skilled predator who'd perfected the art of appearing trustworthy. The civil trial was scheduled for the following month. Unlike the criminal proceedings, this would focus on Diane's financial crimes and the emotional damage she'd caused. I would finally get to tell the full story of how she'd manipulated me. Not just the attempted murder, but the years of careful grooming that had preceded it. I wasn't nervous about testifying. I'd found my voice during the criminal trial and had only grown stronger since then. Diane's power over me had been based on my willingness to doubt myself, to defer to her supposed expertise, to prioritize her feelings over my own instincts. None of that was true anymore. 3 weeks later, I stood in the witness box and told my story to a room full of strangers. I spoke clearly and calmly about the will, the medical power of attorney, the subtle ways Diane had isolated me from other relationships. I described her notebook, her surveillance, her careful calculation of my vulnerabilities. When Diane's attorney tried to suggest I'd been a willing participant in the financial arrangements, I looked him directly in the eye. "I was a victim of fraud," I said firmly. "I trusted someone who presented herself as a friend while systematically planning to rob and murder me. The fact that I survived her scheme doesn't make me complicit in it." The jury awarded damages to all the families. Diane's assets, including the house she'd bought with stolen money, would be sold to provide some small compensation for the lives she'd destroyed. It wouldn't bring back the dead women, but it would help their children and grandchildren rebuild their financial security. After the trial, I drove home to my quiet apartment and made myself a cup of tea. I sat in my living room, surrounded by books I'd chosen and furniture I'd picked out myself, and felt a deep sense of completion. The legal proceedings were over. Justice had been served as fully as it ever could be. I didn't destroy Diane Phillips. She destroyed herself through years of calculated cruelty and greed. I just refused to go down with her. I just chose to save myself instead of drowning while trying to save someone who was pulling me under. The woman who'd been manipulated and controlled was gone. In her place was someone who trusted her own judgment, who valued genuine connections over convenient relationships, who understood the difference between being helpful and being used. I picked up my journal and wrote, "My life, my choices, my peace, hard-won and unshakable." Then I closed the journal and went to water my roses. They were blooming beautifully in the evening light, filling my garden with color and fragrance. Tomorrow, I would share some cuttings with Elena, who would appreciate their beauty without calculating their worth. This was what victory looked like. Not revenge, but recovery. Not destruction, but reconstruction. Not hatred, but healing. I was finally, completely free. Did you enjoy my story? Which city are you watching from? Let's meet in the comments. If you liked this story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments. On the screen, you'll see 2 new life stories I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story.